Time leaves behind more than monuments and records. It leaves questions etched into places, documents, and human testimony. Some accounts remain unresolved, their evidence scattered across centuries and separated by uncertainty. Tonight, we trace 3 hours of haunting historical enigmas, following the clues where they lead. High above the landscape of Aberdeenshire, Tap O Noth rises in broad, windswept slopes, its summit marked by the remains of one of Scotland's most remarkable hill forts. At roughly 563 meters above sea level, the site commands a wide view over the surrounding country, while beneath the heather lie traces of walls, platforms, hearths, and structures shaped by people more than 2,000 years ago. At first glance, there is little to distinguish the hill from the rugged terrain around it. Yet, near the summit, the character of the landscape changes. The upper fort was enclosed by a substantial stone wall, estimated at between 6 and 8 meters in width, and once rising as high as 5 meters. In places, the stones have been fused together by intense heat, producing what archaeologists call vitrification. It is this vitrified stone core that gives Tap O Noth much of its enduring fascination. Vitrification is not evidence of an inexplicable event. Archaeological research in northeastern Scotland has established that some hill fort walls were constructed with timber incorporated through their stone cores. When such structures were deliberately fired, the combination of stone, wood, and sustained heat could cause portions of the rampart to melt and fuse. Experiments have also suggested that considerable quantities of fuel would have been required to produce this effect. But the practical explanation leaves another question open. Why was the wall fired? One possibility is conflict. A fort may have been attacked, captured, and subsequently burned, with the destruction serving not simply a military purpose, but a psychological one. Yet, archaeologists cannot always determine whether vitrification occurred during an assault, deliberate destruction, or some other episode in the life of a settlement. The fire tells us something happened. It does not, by itself, tell us precisely why, and Tap O Noth offers more clues than the vitrified wall alone. The lower enclosure covers an extraordinary 21 hectares, with surveys identifying as many as 808 possible hut platforms. Excavations have revealed hearths, pottery, animal bone, evidence of metalworking, and imported Roman material, suggesting that activity at the hill extended through several phases and periods. Radiocarbon evidence places the construction and occupation of the upper fort broadly between the 5th and 1st centuries BC, while later activity continued into the Roman and early medieval periods. This raises the possibility that the hill was not simply a defensive stronghold, but a place repeatedly occupied, adapted, and reinterpreted by different communities. The stone itself may therefore be telling only part of the story. Some interpretations of vitrified forts have proposed elaborate methods of construction, deliberate ceremonial destruction, or demonstrations of power designed to leave a permanent impression on those who witness them. Such ideas remain difficult to prove. The archaeological evidence supports intense burning and complex occupation, but it cannot establish every motive attributed to the people who built or destroyed the walls. Even the physical remains resist a simple reading. Much of the rampart has collapsed, while later stone robbing and antiquarian excavation have altered parts of the site. A 19th-century excavation of the upper fort found little, and modern investigations have likewise revealed that absence of surviving structures does not necessarily mean absence of activity. So, standing among the weathered stones of Tap O Noth, the most compelling question may not concern fire itself, but intention. Was the vitrified core the consequence of warfare, a deliberate act of destruction, a display of authority, or something connected with practices we no longer understand? The evidence narrows the possibilities, but it does not close the case. And somewhere within the fractured stones, the collapsed ramparts, and the silent outlines of hundreds of habitation platforms, the original purpose of that great fire may still remain beyond our reach. Far from the rugged heights of Scotland, the landscape changes dramatically. In the broad valleys of central Kazakhstan, beneath immense skies and along the riverlands of Saryarka, enormous stone structures rise from the steppe. Their walls are built from carefully arranged slabs and massive blocks, forming the Begazy megalithic mausolea, monuments created for the dead, but seemingly designed to speak to the living as well. These structures belong to the Begazy Dandibay culture of the Late Bronze Age, a society that flourished in central Kazakhstan during the final centuries of the 2nd millennium BC and into the early 1st millennium BC. Archaeologists have identified a distinctive group of monumental tombs, characterized by central burial chambers enclosed within multiple stone walls. Some were constructed with enormous vertical slabs, while others incorporated carefully fitted masonry and substantial stone roofs. At Begazy itself, the scale is striking. One excavated mausoleum measured nearly 10 meters across, with walls reaching considerable thickness. An entrance on the eastern side led through a long stone corridor toward the burial chamber, while a passage around the central chamber contained dozens of ceramic vessels. Nearby stood a stone podium associated with upright stones, adding another layer to an already elaborate funerary landscape. The practical explanation is relatively clear. These were monumental burial places probably constructed for individuals of elevated status. The contrast between the great mausolea and much smaller graves nearby suggests a society in which certain people held considerable authority. Weapons, ornaments, pottery, and ritual objects recovered from the monuments reinforce the impression that these were not ordinary burials. But the stones begin to raise questions that archaeology cannot answer quite so easily. Why devote such enormous labor to a single tomb? The construction required skilled builders, organized labor, access to suitable stone, and the ability to coordinate a substantial community. The monuments therefore reveal something about social structure, as much as they reveal something about death. They suggest that the people of the Begazy Dandibay culture possessed traditions of authority, ritual, and collective organization that were considerably more developed than the simple image of scattered Bronze Age communities might imply. There is another detail that makes these monuments especially compelling. The deceased were not always treated in precisely the same way. Archaeological evidence points to changes in burial practices, including both crouched and extended positions. The orientation of some burials has also been interpreted as reflecting beliefs concerning the sun, ancestors, and the journey of the dead. These interpretations remain tentative, because ritual meaning rarely survives in a form that can be read with certainty thousands of years later. And then there is the wider landscape. The mausolea were not isolated monuments. They existed alongside settlements, smaller graves, stone enclosures, and other archaeological remains. At Begazy, dozens of structures occupy the burial ground, while the surrounding region contains a much larger network of sites associated with the same cultural tradition. The dead were therefore placed within a landscape already shaped by settlement, movement, production, and memory. Some interpretations go further, suggesting that the architecture encoded ideas about the cosmos or the relationship between the living, the ancestors, and the celestial world. Such possibilities are difficult to test. The orientation of a structure can sometimes reveal deliberate planning, but without written records, connecting architecture to a specific religious belief remains an interpretation rather than a fact. Even the identity of those buried inside remains uncertain. Were they chiefs who controlled communities and resources? Religious figures whose authority rested on ritual knowledge? Hereditary leaders whose descendants transformed their graves into symbols of legitimacy? Or did the mausolea serve several purposes at once: tomb, ceremonial space, and monument to collective identity? The archaeological evidence points toward an influential elite, but it does not provide their names, their voices, or a direct account of what these stones meant to them. Centuries later, the Mausolea still dominate the landscape with a quiet authority. Their builders are gone, their language is largely inaccessible, and the beliefs that shaped the ceremonies have survived only in fragments of stone, pottery, bone, and architecture. The monuments tell us that these people cared deeply about how their dead were remembered, but whether we can ever fully understand the beliefs behind that monumental effort remains another question, one still standing among the stones of Begazy. From the great stone monuments of Begazy, the trail now turns toward a landscape of another kind, one where stone does not rise toward the sky but descends into darkness. Across Britain, limestone cliffs, narrow fissures, rock shelters, and underground chambers have long occupied a curious place in the imagination. Some are natural formations shaped by water over immense periods of time. Others were modified by human hands, their passages widened, their surfaces marked, or their entrances incorporated into later structures. In the right light, a cave can appear almost deliberately constructed, as though the landscape itself had opened a doorway. It is tempting to associate such places with the Druids, but the archaeological record demands caution. The ancient Druids left no surviving body of written teaching, no identifiable temple complex that can confidently be assigned to them, and no inscription declaring that a particular cave belonged to their order. Much of what is known about Druids comes from Greek and Roman writers, whose accounts were written from outside the societies they described and sometimes carried obvious political or cultural agendas. Archaeology can illuminate the religious world of Iron Age Britain, but connecting a specific object or location directly to the Druids is rarely possible. Yet, that uncertainty makes the caves no less compelling. Archaeological evidence shows that people in Iron Age Britain and Gaul did use unusual places in the landscape for ritual activity. Offerings were deposited in water. Valuable objects were deliberately placed in unusual contexts, and some ritual practices involved deep shafts and locations that may have been understood as points of connection with another realm. Oxford archaeologist Barry Cunliffe has highlighted this recurring association between ritual activity, the earth, water, burial, and ideas concerning an underworld. Could caves have belonged to the same religious landscape? It is possible, but possibility is not proof. The attraction is understandable. A cave is physically unlike the ordinary world. Daylight disappears within a few meters. Sound changes. Water may drip from the ceiling with measured persistence, while narrow passages force a visitor to move slowly, sometimes alone and sometimes by touch. For communities without electric light, entering such a place would have required fire, preparation, and a deliberate willingness to leave the familiar landscape behind. That physical transformation may have carried symbolic meaning. The earth was not necessarily perceived simply as solid ground. Underground spaces could have represented boundaries between different realms, places associated with ancestors, spirits, fertility, death, or renewal. Such interpretations fit broader patterns visible in prehistoric and Iron Age ritual archaeology, although assigning any particular belief to the Druids themselves remains uncertain. And this is where the historical record becomes especially difficult to separate from later imagination. Centuries after the Iron Age, antiquarians and folklorists began attaching the word Druid to stones, springs, groves, caves, and other unusual places. The name became a convenient explanation for monuments whose original purpose had already been forgotten. Later still, modern Druid movements adopted and reshaped many of these traditions, sometimes presenting particular landscapes as surviving remnants of an ancient religious system. The result is a layered landscape in which several different periods can overlap. A cave may be genuinely prehistoric. A carving may be medieval. A local legend may have emerged centuries later, and the association with Druids may be comparatively recent. One of the clearest reminders of this problem comes from sites that appear ancient but contain evidence of much later activity. At Rotor Rocks in Derbyshire, for example, an atmospheric network of natural and modified rock spaces contains carvings and features long associated with Druidic traditions. Yet, the carvings attributed to Reverend Thomas Eyre date to the late 18th century, when the ancient order of Druids was already part of a modern revival of Druidic identity. The distinction is crucial. The existence of a Druid cave in local tradition does not necessarily demonstrate that Iron Age Druids used it. So, where does that leave the possibility of genuine sacred caverns? There are several possibilities. Some underground spaces may simply have served practical purposes: shelter, storage, extraction, or refuge. Others may have acquired ritual significance because of their unusual natural characteristics. Still, others could have been visited for ceremonies whose details have disappeared completely, and there may have been places where practical and religious purposes overlapped. A spring emerging from rock, for instance, could provide water while simultaneously becoming a place for offerings. A cave could offer shelter while also representing an entrance into the earth. A burial chamber could preserve the remains of the dead while functioning as a location where the living maintained relationships with their ancestors. Ancient religious life rarely fits neatly into modern categories. The Roman accounts make the subject darker still. Writers such as Julius Caesar and later authors described Druids as a powerful religious class involved in law, education, political affairs, and ritual. Some accounts also associate them with human sacrifice. Archaeology provides evidence for ritual violence and unusual burials in Iron Age Britain, but the precise role of Druids in these practices remains debated. That leaves an uncomfortable gap between what the Romans claimed and what archaeology can independently demonstrate. Were certain underground places genuinely connected with rituals of death? Could some caves have been used for ceremonies involving offerings or altered states of consciousness? Or have later generations simply projected the image of the Druid onto places whose original meaning was already inaccessible? There is no single answer. Even the word Druid conceals complexity. They may have been priests, teachers, judges, political advisors, and custodians of religious knowledge rather than a narrowly defined priesthood in the modern sense. Their traditions were largely oral, which means that the disappearance of the institution also meant the disappearance of much of its own explanation of the world. Perhaps that is why caves have remained so powerful in the story. They preserve physical traces without preserving the voices that once explained them. A footprint disappears. A spoken ceremony leaves no transcript. A belief can survive for generations and then become incomprehensible within a few centuries. Yet the cave remains, a chamber of stone shaped by natural forces, altered by human hands, and repeatedly reinterpreted by those who encounter it. In the darkness, there may be evidence of ritual. There may also be nothing more than the marks of ordinary human activity. And somewhere between those possibilities lies the real fascination. Not the certainty that the Druids possessed secret caverns, but the possibility that some ancient places were meaningful in ways we can no longer reconstruct. The stones and passages can tell us where people went. The harder question is why they entered, and what they believed they would encounter once the daylight disappeared behind them. Across the Sardinian countryside, low stone structures emerge from grassland, woodland, and open hillsides, sometimes almost disappearing into the terrain. Their walls are weathered, their great stones softened by centuries of wind and rain, yet their distinctive shapes remain recognizable. These are the smaller and lesser-known examples of Sardinia's famous Tombe dei Giganti, the so-called giants' graves. The name itself immediately creates an image that the archaeology does not support. These were not tombs built for giants. They were collective funerary monuments associated with the nuragic culture of Sardinia, generally dating from the Bronze Age. Archaeological surveys have recorded hundreds of such monuments across the island, with concentrations particularly evident in central and western regions. Their architecture varies, but many share a long burial chamber, a broad semicircular forecourt known as an exedra, and an imposing central element that gives the monument much of its visual character. Some of the smaller sites are little more than fragments today. At Samenta, near Torpe, what remains is largely a chaotic accumulation of stone. The monument was severely damaged by unauthorized excavation and mechanical intervention, leaving archaeologists with only partial evidence of its original arrangement. The missing central stele is particularly significant because that feature can help researchers understand how the monument once looked. Other sites have survived remarkably well. At Sadomu I Sorku near Sidti, a long burial chamber and sweeping semicircular forecourt remain visible, constructed largely from basalt taken from the surrounding plateau. The monument dates to the Middle Bronze Age, broadly around 1500 to 1300 BC. Its preserved architecture offers a rare opportunity to see how imposing these funerary spaces could have appeared when they were still active. But the smaller examples may tell us something that the grand monuments cannot. They remind us that this was not a single monumental project concentrated in one location. The tradition was distributed across the island, repeated in different communities and adapted to local materials and landscapes. Some monuments were built from enormous upright slabs, others used carefully laid masonry. Over time, the architecture changed, suggesting that funerary customs themselves were evolving. What did these places mean to the people who built them? The conventional interpretation is clear enough. They were collective tombs, associated with the burial of multiple individuals rather than a single ruler. The long chambers provided space for successive burials, while the semicircular exedra appears to have created an area connected with funerary activity and ceremony. Archaeology, therefore, gives us a strong foundation for understanding their basic function. Yet, function is not the same as meaning. A structure can be identified as a tomb without revealing what its builders believed happened after death. That distinction becomes particularly important when we look at the architecture. Several giants' graves incorporate a tall central stone, sometimes called a curved or arched stele. At Coduvecchio, one of the best preserved examples, the central monument once rose more than 4 meters above the surrounding stones. A small opening at its base provided access toward the burial chamber. To a modern observer, that opening can appear almost symbolic. Was it simply an architectural entrance? Did it possess ritual significance? Could it have represented a passage between the world of the living and the resting place of the dead? Archaeologists have proposed interpretations involving symbolic ideas of transition, regeneration, and communal remembrance. But the evidence does not provide a definitive explanation for every architectural detail. The absence of written nuragic religious texts leaves considerable room for interpretation, and this uncertainty has encouraged more imaginative theories. Some modern writers have connected the monuments with fertility rituals, astronomical alignments, or elaborate beliefs concerning rebirth and the movement of the soul. Others have attempted to associate the semicircular forecourt with the horns of a bull, noting the recurring resemblance between certain monuments and a stylized bovine form. Sardegna Cultura describes the characteristic outline as recalling a bull's head, although the exact symbolic meaning remains open to interpretation. There is also the enduring folklore behind the name itself. Local tradition associated these enormous-looking burial monuments with giants, and reports of unusually large human bones helped reinforce the story. But archaeology provides no credible evidence for a race of giant humans living on Sardinia. The impressive scale belongs to the architecture, not to the people buried there. The reality may be quieter, but perhaps more revealing. These communities possess the organization necessary to quarry, transport, shape, and position heavy stone. They repeatedly invested labor in places devoted to the dead, and they maintained architectural traditions for generations, modifying the form while preserving the underlying concept of collective burial. One particularly intriguing example is Su Quadu Inixius, near Luna Matrona. It is considered one of the earliest giants' graves in Sardinia, with a proposed date around 1700 to 1600 BC. Its burial chamber extends for roughly 10 meters, while the central sandstone stele reaches almost 3 meters in height. Here, the chronology itself becomes part of the puzzle. How did this distinctive funerary tradition emerge? Was it developed gradually from earlier megalithic practices? Did communities across Sardinia independently adapt a shared religious concept? Or did ideas, people, and technologies move across the Mediterranean, bringing influences that have not yet been fully traced? The evidence suggests continuity and development, but the precise origins remain difficult to reconstruct. And the smaller monuments carry another kind of mystery: absence. Some have lost their stele. Others have collapsed chambers. Some survive only as scattered stones. At certain sites, archaeological investigation has been limited, leaving questions about construction phases, burial practices, and later reuse unanswered. Even when excavation is possible, ancient ritual is rarely recovered intact. Objects may be missing, organic materials may have disappeared, and later disturbance can blur the sequence of events. So the monument becomes a kind of archaeological silhouette. We can see its shape. We can estimate its age. We can identify its function. But the emotional world surrounding it remains largely inaccessible. Perhaps that is why the smaller giants' graves deserve attention. They do not dominate the landscape in the same way as the most famous monuments. Some are partially collapsed, overgrown, or almost overlooked. Yet, within their damaged walls lies evidence of a society that devoted considerable effort to death, memory, and communal identity. Standing beside one today, the silence can feel almost complete. The people who gathered here are gone. Their language is only partially understood. Their rituals were not recorded in writing. Their beliefs must be reconstructed from stone, burial remains, architecture, and comparison with other archaeological evidence. The giants are absent because they never needed to exist. The monument itself is real. The dead were real, the labor was real, and whatever meaning these stones once carried may still be present in their arrangement, waiting for archaeology to come closer to an answer, or to discover that the original meaning can never be recovered completely. On a low ridge in County Wicklow, the remains of Rathgall spread quietly across the landscape. Grass covers much of the earth. Trees now frame the approaches, and the wind moves easily over the ancient stonework. Yet, beneath this peaceful appearance lies an archaeological complex of unusual scale. Concentric ramparts enclosing a settlement that was active for centuries, perhaps beginning as early as the late Bronze Age. Today, Rathgall is officially known as Rathgall Ringfort, and its Irish name, An Rathgall, can be translated as the Bright Fort. Another traditional interpretation of its name gives the sense of a fort of foreigners, or fort of strangers. The monument occupies approximately 7.5 hectares, with 3 concentric stone ramparts dating mainly to the Bronze Age, and a smaller inner enclosure that was added or substantially renewed during the medieval period. From the ground, the scale is difficult to appreciate. The fort was not simply a single circular wall surrounding a house. It was a layered landscape of defenses, habitation, craft production, burial, and movement. Each ring created another boundary between the outside world and the center. Approaching the interior would have meant passing through successive lines of stone, gradually moving toward the heart of the settlement. Why construct such an elaborate arrangement? The simplest explanation is security. Rathgall stands in a position that offered extensive views over the surrounding countryside. A fortified settlement on a ridge could provide protection, while also allowing its inhabitants to observe movement across the landscape. But defense may only have been one part of the story. The archaeological evidence suggests that Rathgall was also a place of wealth, skilled production, and social importance. Excavations beginning in 1969 under Professor Barry Raftery revealed an extraordinary quantity of material. During the first season alone, more than 10,000 objects were recovered from the inner enclosure, including stone and metal objects, glass, gold, and clay molds used in bronze production. Later, excavations produced pottery, animal remains, basketry, evidence of grain cultivation, and further signs of metalworking. This changes the way the fort can be understood. A place capable of producing large quantities of bronze tools and weapons was not simply a refuge. It was a center of activity. Perhaps Rathgall was controlled by an influential family whose wealth depended upon craft production and agricultural resources. Perhaps it served a wider community whose specialists worked within the protection of its walls. Or perhaps its importance came from its position within a network of exchange that connected communities across Ireland and beyond. The artifacts provide tantalizing clues. Among the most remarkable discoveries were 88 blue-green glass beads recovered during the 1974 excavation. Glass of this kind was a valuable material in Bronze Age Europe, and its presence at Rathgall points toward connections extending well beyond the immediate landscape. Other finds included gold objects and a mercury-gilded metal disc. Analysis of the disc placed it around 1000 BC, making it an exceptionally early example of mercury gilding in Western Europe. What does such wealth tell us about the people who lived here? It suggests hierarchy. It suggests access to specialized knowledge, and it suggests connections. But it does not tell us exactly who controlled those resources or how the community itself was organized. Inside the innermost enclosure, archaeologists discovered post holes belonging to a small house. The structure itself has long since disappeared, leaving only the pattern of posts cut into the ground. This is one of the recurring difficulties of archaeology. The buildings that once defined daily life may leave almost nothing above ground, while the objects abandoned around them survive for thousands of years. Rathgall therefore offers an unusual contrast. Its massive stone defenses remain visible, but the people who occupied the space must be reconstructed from fragments, and among those fragments are traces of something more intimate. One burial discovery involved the cremated remains of a baby, placed in a pit beneath a carefully positioned boulder. Mixed among the burnt bones was a small gold-plated copper ring. The deliberate placement of the stone suggests that this was not simply an accidental deposit, yet the precise circumstances surrounding the burial remain beyond recovery. Was the burial connected to a particular ritual? Did the gold object carry personal significance? Was the child part of an important family? Or does the burial reflect practices that were once familiar to the community but are now impossible to reconstruct? These are questions archaeology can approach, but rarely answer completely. The fort itself raises another puzzle. Rathgall is generally dated mainly to the 12th and 11th centuries BC, although evidence indicates activity both earlier and later. The site was occupied again during the Iron Age, when an iron smelting furnace was established, and medieval material, including coins and green-glazed pottery, shows that people returned to the enclosure during the 12th and 13th centuries AD. This means that Rathgall was not frozen at one moment in time. Its meaning changed. A Bronze Age settlement eventually became an Iron Age location, and later acquired medieval associations. The innermost stone circle belongs to this later phase, illustrating how succeeding communities could modify an existing monumental landscape rather than simply abandoning it. That continuity is perhaps more intriguing than any single artifact. Why return to a place whose original inhabitants had disappeared centuries earlier? Was the location still strategically valuable? Did its monumental appearance preserve a memory of former power? Or did later communities simply find the old enclosure useful and adapt it to their own needs? Irish tradition eventually connected Rathgall with Celtic royalty, including Crundmail Bolg Luatha, a king of the Uí Tsainsalag dynasty said to have died in AD 628. Yet, this association belongs to a much later historical and legendary tradition than the Bronze Age fort itself. The stones predate the traditional king by many centuries, and this distinction matters. Ancient monuments often acquire stories long after their builders are gone. A dramatic structure without a surviving explanation naturally invites memory, legend, and reinterpretation. Over generations, the identity of the original builders can disappear while the monument itself remains. Rathgall may therefore have been many things at different points in its existence: a fortified settlement, a center of craft production, a place of social authority, a burial landscape, and later a site onto which new traditions were projected. Perhaps its greatest mystery is not what the fort was built for, but how many different meanings it carried during its long life. The stone ramparts can tell us where boundaries stood. The furnaces reveal that skilled production took place within them. The beads and precious objects point toward distant connections. The tiny burial speaks of an individual whose life ended thousands of years ago. Yet, none of these discoveries provides a voice from the people themselves. We do not know what they called this place. We do not know how its rulers understood their authority, what ceremonies took place inside its walls, or what the community believed when it placed a child beneath a carefully set stone. And perhaps the most unsettling possibility is also the simplest. The people of Rathgall may have considered its purpose completely ordinary. To them, the walls, houses, workshops, burials, and boundaries may have formed an understandable world. It is only now, separated from that world by more than 3,000 years, that the same stones appear enigmatic. The evidence gives us outlines, but not the full story. Rathgall remains standing as a record of wealth, craftsmanship, protection, death, and repeated occupation. Yet, somewhere between its concentric walls and the scattered remains of those who lived there, another part of the story has endured without being written down. What did the people at the center of Rathgall believe they were building, and what might still lie within the archaeology, waiting to bring their world into sharper focus? A short distance from the dramatic landscapes of southern Corsica, where granite ridges rise above dense Mediterranean vegetation, the remains of Castellu di Cucuruzzu appear almost concealed within the landscape. Massive blocks of stone rest among oak, chestnut, and maquis, forming walls, passages, terraces, and rough chambers that seem less like the ruins of a single building than the remains of an entire fortified world. And after the monuments we have already encountered, this place introduces another kind of mystery, one that does not depend on enormous temples or monumental statues, but on the atmosphere created by stone, isolation, and silence. Castellu di Cucuruzzu stands in the Alta Rocca region of southern Corsica, an area known for rugged mountains, forests, and prehistoric remains. The site was occupied during the Bronze Age, although evidence indicates that human activity in the area began earlier. What survives today is not a perfectly preserved fortress, but a complex of stone structures built and modified over generations. The first impression can be deceptive. From a distance, the ruins seem almost chaotic. Large granite slabs appear to have been stacked wherever the terrain allowed, producing walls that follow the natural contours of the hillside. But closer inspection reveals something more deliberate. Narrow passages wind between massive stones. Elevated platforms overlook the surrounding landscape. Enclosed spaces disappear into the vegetation. Some sections appear to have served practical purposes, while others are much more difficult to interpret. This combination of natural rock and human construction is one of the reasons Cucuruzzu has attracted archaeological interest. The people who built here belong to prehistoric communities whose lives are known primarily through material remains. They left behind stone architecture, pottery, tools, and traces of settlement, but almost nothing that tells us directly what they believed or how they understood the world around them. And that absence creates a problem. Archaeologists can identify walls, they can date artifacts, they can compare construction techniques with other prehistoric settlements across Corsica and the wider Mediterranean. But understanding the precise purpose of every space is much more difficult. Was Cucuruzzu primarily a fortified settlement? Was it a place of refuge during periods of conflict? Was it a community center, a place of storage, or a location where ritual activities took place? The most conventional interpretation is that the site had a defensive and domestic function. Its position on elevated terrain would have provided advantages for observation and protection, while the massive granite architecture could have created secure spaces for people and resources. Yet, the word fortress can sometimes make prehistoric sites sound more straightforward than they really were. There was no single blueprint for Cucuruzzu. The complex developed over time, and its builders worked with an environment already dominated by enormous natural granite formations. Instead of clearing the landscape and constructing an entirely separate architectural complex, they incorporated the landscape itself into their design. In places, the distinction between natural rock and human-made wall becomes surprisingly difficult to follow. A boulder becomes part of a barrier. A narrow opening becomes a passage. A natural depression becomes an enclosed space. Stone surfaces create platforms and sheltered areas. The result is architecture that seems to grow directly from the mountain. Perhaps that was intentional. For prehistoric builders, the landscape may not have been an obstacle to architecture. It may have been part of the architecture. There is also something unsettling about the way the settlement survives today. Vegetation has reclaimed much of the site. Trees grow beside walls that have stood for thousands of years. Roots push between stones. Moss and weathering soften the edges of structures created by people who lived in a world very different from our own. Walking through such a place can produce an unusual sensation. The settlement is visible, but its inhabitants are almost completely absent. We know they were here. We know they built. We know they organized spaces, moved enormous stones, produced tools and pottery, and established themselves in this difficult terrain. But the personal details are gone. No written account tells us who directed the construction. No surviving inscription explains the meaning of the structures. No ancient document describes what happened here during the final years of occupation. Instead, archaeologists must reconstruct the story from fragments. And among those fragments are clues that have encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some theories imagine Cucuruzzu as a place connected with lost traditions, forgotten cults, or ceremonial practices whose meanings disappeared long before written history. Others have emphasized the sheer scale of some of the stones and wondered whether conventional explanations fully capture the organizational abilities of the people who built the complex. But the stones themselves offer a quieter answer. They do not require mysterious technologies to be impressive. Moving heavy granite blocks would have demanded planning, cooperation, time, and an intimate understanding of the terrain. The achievement becomes no less remarkable simply because it can be explained through human effort. In fact, perhaps the greater mystery is not how the stones were moved, but why this particular place mattered enough for generations of people to invest so much labor in it. What did they see when they stood among these rocks? What dangers were they preparing for? What stories were told beside these walls after darkness fell? And when the settlement eventually declined, what caused its inhabitants to leave? Archaeology can approach some of these questions, but it cannot answer all of them. Cucuruzzu was not abandoned yesterday. Thousands of years have separated us from the people who knew its paths intimately. Their voices disappeared, their customs changed, and the meanings attached to individual structures were gradually lost. Today, only fragments remain. Yet, those fragments preserve something remarkably powerful. Evidence of a community deliberately shaping a landscape while also adapting itself to that landscape. The stones remain where they were placed. The passages still follow the contours of the rock. The surrounding mountains still frame the settlement much as they must have done for its prehistoric inhabitants. And somewhere within that arrangement may lie the explanation for why Cucuruzzu was built in the first place. Perhaps it was principally a fortified settlement, shaped by the practical concerns of survival. Perhaps some of its spaces carried ceremonial meaning. Perhaps, as often happens with prehistoric monuments, its purpose changed over generations, leaving behind layers of intention that can no longer be separated. The archaeological evidence gives us pieces of the story, but it does not give us the whole story. And as the forest closes around the ancient stones of Castellu di Cucuruzzu, the unanswered questions become part of the landscape itself, quietly preserved between the walls, waiting for future discoveries to reveal whether the people who built this remarkable place left behind one final clue, hidden somewhere beneath the stones. From the granite landscape of Corsica, our journey now moves far to the west, toward an island where another ancient mystery was carved, not into standing stones but directly into a mountainside. On the northern coast of Gran Canaria, beneath the dry cliffs and rugged terrain, an extraordinary network of small chambers waits inside the rock. This is the Valerón Caves, sometimes known as the Valerón Monastery. From the outside, the site can appear almost unremarkable. The surrounding cliffs rise in pale layers above the landscape, shaped by wind, rain, and volcanic forces. But within one of these formations is something remarkably deliberate. Hundreds of cavities arranged across several levels, opening into the rock like a collection of dark windows. The effect is strangely intimate. There is no enormous entrance announcing a royal monument. No towering statue tells us who created it. Instead, there is a wall of stone pierced by countless openings, each leading into a small chamber. And the more closely the structure is examined, the more difficult it becomes to understand what these spaces meant to the people who created them. The caves are associated with the ancient inhabitants of Gran Canaria, who lived on the island long before the arrival of European powers. Archaeological evidence indicates that the complex was used as a collective storage and funerary location, with the individual cavities generally interpreted as places where goods, or possibly bodies and associated materials, could be kept. The traditional name, Valerón Monastery, is much more recent. It emerged from later European interpretations, when the unusual chambers were misunderstood as the retreat of religious women, but there were no medieval monks living inside these walls. The reality is considerably older. The indigenous people of Gran Canaria developed a distinctive society adapted to an island environment. They cultivated crops, raised animals, manufactured tools and pottery, and established settlements across different ecological zones. Their relationship with caves was especially important. Natural caves were used as homes, burial places, storage areas, and locations connected with social and religious practices. Valerón appears to belong to that broader tradition. Yet there is something unusual about its scale. The complex contains hundreds of individual compartments carved into a natural rock formation. Many are relatively small, and their arrangement suggests repeated modification over time rather than the construction of a single unified chamber system. This raises an important question. Why create so many separate spaces? One practical explanation is storage. Gran Canaria's prehistoric communities depended heavily on preserving agricultural products, particularly during periods when food could not simply be gathered or produced immediately. A protected, elevated location could help safeguard valuable resources from moisture, animals, and other threats. The natural rock offered another advantage. Temperature and humidity inside sheltered cavities can remain more stable than conditions outside, making caves useful environments for preservation. But archaeological discoveries at Valerón have also connected the site with funerary practices. Human remains and archaeological materials have been found in association with the complex and nearby caves, reinforcing the possibility that certain spaces had mortuary functions. And this is where the site becomes more difficult to interpret. Was Valerón primarily a storage facility? Was it a funerary complex? Or did its meaning change depending on the space, period, and people using it? Perhaps the answer is not one or the other. Ancient societies rarely organized their world according to modern categories. A location associated with ancestors could also hold valuable possessions. A storage chamber could exist within a landscape considered sacred. Practical necessities and spiritual beliefs could occupy the same physical space. The caves may therefore represent several layers of activity rather than a single purpose. Their physical appearance has also encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some theories have imagined the chambers as places reserved for women, particularly because of later traditions that gave the site its monastic name. Other interpretations have attempted to connect the complex with fertility rituals, initiation ceremonies, or secretive religious practices. These ideas vary considerably in credibility, and archaeological evidence does not establish all of them. Yet, the absence of written records leaves room for uncertainty. The indigenous inhabitants of Gran Canaria left no surviving written explanation telling us exactly what each cavity represented. Much of what we know has been reconstructed from archaeology, later historical accounts, artifacts, human remains, and comparisons with other sites across the Canary Islands. That means every interpretation must begin with physical evidence. And the physical evidence presents another intriguing detail: the effort required to create the chambers. The cavities were not simply discovered ready for use. Many were enlarged or carved into relatively soft volcanic material using stone tools and other implements available to the island's inhabitants. The work would have been repetitive and demanding. One chamber might have been manageable. Hundreds required organization. Someone had to decide where to excavate. Someone had to remove the material. Someone had to maintain access to the upper sections. And generations of people may have returned to the site, altering spaces that had already been used by those who came before them. That possibility changes the character of Valerón. It may not be a monument created during a single moment in history. It may instead be a record of repeated human activity, accumulated slowly over generations. Imagine entering the caves centuries ago. The light outside would quickly fade behind you. The air would become cooler. The sound of footsteps would echo against the rock. Above and around you, dozens or hundreds of dark openings would disappear into the walls. Would this have felt like a warehouse, a cemetery, a sacred place, or something that modern language cannot describe adequately? The atmosphere itself has contributed to the site's mysterious reputation. Later visitors naturally tried to explain what they saw. Without knowledge of the indigenous culture that created the chambers, they interpreted the structure through familiar European ideas. The name monastery became attached to the caves, even though the actual history belonged to a much earlier world. This is an important reminder of how archaeological mysteries can be created. Sometimes, the mystery does not come from a complete absence of evidence. It comes from evidence being separated from the culture that produced it. A chamber survives. A tool survives. A burial survives. But the meaning that once connected them may disappear. And Valerón presents exactly that problem. We can measure the cavities. We can study their arrangement. We can examine the materials found within and around them. We can compare them with other indigenous sites throughout Gran Canaria. But can we recover the thoughts of the people who first entered these spaces? Can archaeology tell us whether they regarded the caves as practical repositories, sacred locations, places connected with ancestors, or all of these things simultaneously? Perhaps some future discovery will provide another piece of the puzzle. A previously overlooked artifact. A new archaeological interpretation. A better understanding of indigenous traditions preserved elsewhere on the islands. Until then, Valerón remains suspended between what can be demonstrated and what can only be cautiously imagined. Its hundreds of dark chambers continue to stare outward from the volcanic rock, silent witnesses to a society that adapted to an isolated island world and developed its own ways of preserving food, possessions, and perhaps memories of the dead. And when the last light disappears across the cliffs, the openings become dark once again. What was placed inside them? Who was allowed to enter? And what stories once accompanied the objects and remains that have long since disappeared? The stones cannot answer. They can only preserve the spaces and leave us wondering how much of their original meaning is still hidden within the rock. From the shadowed chambers of Valerón, our journey now moves north across the sea to the windswept landscape of Cornwall, where another abandoned settlement survives in a very different form. Here, the mystery is not hidden deep inside a mountain, but scattered across open ground among granite walls, low vegetation, and the remains of homes that once formed a small prehistoric community. At first glance, Carn Euny seems almost peaceful. The site lies in the far west of Cornwall, surrounded by the rugged countryside of Penwith. Grass moves with the wind. Heather and gorse cover the hillsides. Beyond the remains, the landscape stretches toward the Atlantic, exposed to weather that has shaped this region for thousands of years. But among the vegetation are the remains of an ancient village. Low stone walls outline former buildings. Circular and rectangular structures mark the positions of houses. Narrow entrances lead into spaces that once sheltered families, while collapsed walls reveal how densely organized the settlement may have been. And then there is the feature that makes Carn Euny particularly intriguing. A long, subterranean passage known as a fogu runs beneath the settlement. Its entrance descends into darkness, leading through a narrow stone-lined chamber whose original purpose remains uncertain. The word itself belongs to Cornish tradition, but the structures known as fogus are much older. Several examples survive in western Cornwall, usually associated with Iron Age and later settlements. Their function has been debated for generations. Were they storage chambers, places of refuge, ritual spaces, or perhaps structures whose purpose changed over time? At Carn Euny, the fogu is especially striking because it survives well enough to give a sense of its original construction. Large slabs form the walls and roof, creating a confined passage where daylight quickly disappears. For anyone entering it, the experience must have been very different from standing among the open ruins above. The village itself belonged to a landscape occupied for centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that activity at Carn Euny extended across a long period, with the settlement undergoing changes before it was eventually abandoned during the later Roman period. That long occupation is important. Carn Euny was not necessarily a village built once and left untouched. Like many prehistoric settlements, it appears to have evolved gradually. Buildings were modified, walls were rebuilt, Spaces changed function. Different generations adapted the settlement to their own needs. The surviving ruins are therefore not a snapshot. They are layers, and each layer makes the original story slightly harder to reconstruct. The most conventional interpretation is that Carn Euny was a farming community. The inhabitants would have depended on agriculture and livestock, while the surrounding landscape provided additional resources. The stone buildings offered protection from Cornwall's harsh weather, and the enclosed settlement would have created a practical environment for domestic life. But then the Fogu complicates the picture. A simple storage explanation has often been proposed. An underground chamber could provide relatively stable conditions for preserving food or other valuable materials. In an agricultural community, that would have been useful. Yet the architecture is elaborate enough to raise another possibility. Why build such a structure underground when simpler storage spaces could have been constructed above ground? The answer may lie in security. A concealed chamber could protect possessions from theft, or perhaps provide shelter during periods of danger. But there is no universal agreement. Some researchers have suggested that Fogus may have had ritual or ceremonial associations. Their darkness, restricted entrances, and separation from ordinary domestic spaces could have given them a special role within Iron Age communities. Still, there is no definitive evidence that every Fogu was a sacred chamber, and Carn Euny reminds us how easily modern assumptions can influence the interpretation of prehistoric architecture. A narrow underground passage feels mysterious to us, but to the people who built it, it may have been perfectly practical. Perhaps it was simply somewhere cool and secure to keep important goods. Perhaps it served a defensive purpose. Perhaps certain ceremonies took place there. Or perhaps its function changed over centuries, beginning as one thing and becoming another. That last possibility may be particularly important. The village existed long enough for generations of inhabitants to inherit structures created by people they never knew. A building could outlive its original purpose. A chamber could acquire a new meaning. Traditions could be adapted rather than abandoned. In that sense, Carn Euny may preserve not one mystery, but several. The settlement also contains architectural details that reveal something about the organization of prehistoric life. Houses were constructed around shared spaces, while thick stone walls divided different areas. Some buildings appear to have been larger and more substantial than others. Could this reflect differences in wealth or social status? Or were the variations simply practical responses to changing needs? Again, archaeology can suggest possibilities but rarely provides a single definitive answer. There is another unsettling aspect to the site. Carn Euny was once a living community. People cooked here. Children grew up here. Animals were kept here. Tools were made and repaired. Food was prepared. Conversations took place inside buildings whose walls now stand empty. Then, at some point, the settlement ceased to function as a village. The exact circumstances of its abandonment remain difficult to reconstruct. There was no single dramatic event that archaeology can confidently identify as the reason everyone left. Instead, the settlement appears to have gradually fallen out of use, part of a wider transformation of communities across Cornwall. Perhaps economic conditions changed. Perhaps settlement patterns shifted. Perhaps political and cultural changes during the Roman period altered how people lived. Or perhaps several pressures accumulated over generations until Carn Euny was no longer the center of community life. What happened afterward is almost as fascinating. Once people stopped maintaining the buildings, nature began reclaiming the site. Walls collapsed. Roofs disappeared. Soil accumulated. Vegetation spread across the ruins. For centuries, the village existed as a kind of archaeological shadow beneath the landscape. And the Fogu remained particularly mysterious. Imagine approaching its entrance after sunset. Above ground, the wind moves through the grass. Below, the passage is silent. There is no obvious marker explaining what happened there. No inscription records its purpose. No ancient account tells us why someone decided to construct an underground chamber beneath the settlement. The structure survives. Its meaning does not. This has encouraged more speculative theories over time. Some have imagined Fogus as places associated with fertility, initiation, ancestral practices, or other forms of ritual activity. Such interpretations cannot be automatically confirmed, but neither can every unusual feature be reduced to simple storage. The truth may have been more complicated. Perhaps the people of Carn did not see a distinction between practical and spiritual spaces. A chamber used to store important goods could also carry symbolic significance. A hidden place could be valuable because of both its physical properties and its cultural meaning. That possibility is difficult to test. The people who knew the answers left no written explanation. What remains are stones, a doorway, a subterranean passage, the foundations of homes, and a landscape that has changed surprisingly little in appearance since the village was abandoned. Standing among the ruins today, it is possible to sense how much of the original settlement has disappeared, and how much has survived by accident. The walls tell us where people lived. The Fogu tells us that they invested effort in spaces whose purpose remains uncertain. The surrounding fields suggest how they survived. But none of these clues can tell us exactly what they believed, and perhaps that is what makes Carn so compelling. The mystery is not simply that something has been forgotten. It is that something once ordinary to the people who lived here has become extraordinary to everyone who came afterward. The Fogu waits beneath the ancient village exactly as it has for centuries. Its stones still fit together. Its passage still descends into darkness. And somewhere between the practical explanations and the more speculative possibilities lies the original reason it was built. Perhaps one day another discovery will reveal that purpose. Until then, Carn remains a quiet fragment of a vanished community, asking a question archaeology cannot completely answer. When the people who built a place disappear, how much of their world can stone preserve, and how much of its meaning disappears with them? From the windswept ruins of Carn where a hidden passage disappeared beneath the floor of an Iron Age settlement, our journey now moves eastward to another landscape shaped by stone, water, conflict, and memory. Here, near the northern reaches of the ancient Levant, an enormous, fortified settlement once stood beside one of the region's most important natural springs. This is Tel Dan. Today, the site lies among lush vegetation and flowing water, an unusual setting for an archaeological mound. Clear streams emerge from the slopes of Mount Hermon, feeding the headwaters of the Jordan River. Around them rise the remains of an ancient city whose history stretches across thousands of years. But among the most imposing remains are its massive defensive ramparts. Built from enormous quantities of earth and stone, these fortifications once surrounded the settlement, separating the inhabitants from the world beyond. Their scale immediately suggests that Tel Dan was more than a small agricultural village. It was a place worth defending. And that raises the first question: what made this particular location so important? The answer begins with geography. Tel Dan stood near one of the principal routes connecting the northern Levant with territories farther south and east. The abundance of water made the surrounding area exceptionally fertile, while the position of the settlement gave it access to routes used by travelers, merchants, armies, and migrating populations. For thousands of years, whoever controlled such a place could potentially influence movement through the region. Archaeological excavations have revealed layers belonging to different periods, demonstrating that Tel Dan was repeatedly occupied, rebuilt, and transformed. The earliest settlement is associated with the Bronze Age, and the city later became an important center during the Iron Age. Its ancient name is generally identified with Laish, a settlement mentioned in biblical traditions. According to the biblical account in the Book of Judges, Laish was captured by the Danite tribe and subsequently renamed Dan. Archaeology cannot simply confirm every detail of that narrative, but the ancient settlement itself is very real, and its remains reveal a complex history of occupation and political change. The ramparts are among the clearest signs of that complexity. Instead of a simple stone wall, the defenses incorporated enormous earthen embankments and substantial construction. In some places, the fortifications created a broad raised barrier around the settlement, making direct access considerably more difficult. To an approaching army, the city would not have appeared easy to enter. But defensive architecture is rarely just about height. The shape of the ramparts, the arrangement of gates, the control of entrances, and the relationship between the walls and the surrounding terrain all mattered. At Tel Dan, one of the most remarkable surviving features is the ancient gateway complex. Its mud brick construction has survived in an extraordinary state, including an arched entrance structure that dates to the Iron Age. The preservation is remarkable because mud brick is normally vulnerable to weathering and collapse. Yet here, the remains survived long enough to reveal something about the engineering capabilities of the people who built the city. They understood how to create monumental architecture from materials that appear surprisingly fragile. And this creates another mystery. Why invest so heavily in defenses? The obvious answer is warfare. The Iron Age Levant was a politically fragmented world, populated by competing kingdoms and city-states. Alliances changed, borders shifted, armies moved across the landscape. A wealthy settlement located along strategic routes could become a target. The walls of Tel Dan may therefore represent a practical response to a dangerous political environment. But there is another possibility. The ramparts were not merely barriers. They were statements. A massive fortification communicated power even before an army arrived. It demonstrated that the settlement possessed the labor, resources, organization, and authority required to build and maintain such defenses. In other words, the walls may have been as much about political identity as military protection. And that distinction matters. A city does not construct enormous defenses only because it fears outsiders. It may also construct them to demonstrate that it has become important enough to require them. Tel Dan appears to have undergone several transformations of precisely this kind. During the Iron Age, the settlement became associated with the northern kingdom that emerged in the region. Its strategic position gave it political importance, while its religious significance also appears to have increased. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a major cultic area, including a large platform and associated structures. This combination of fortress, city, and religious center creates a particularly intriguing picture. The same population that needed walls for protection also created monumental spaces for worship. Military power and religious authority existed side by side. And perhaps the ramparts themselves helped define the boundary between the ordered world inside the city and the uncertain world beyond it. For the people living there, crossing through the gateway may have represented more than simply entering or leaving. Inside were homes, markets, temples, administrative spaces, and familiar streets. Outside were roads, fields, neighboring settlements, travelers, and potentially hostile armies. The wall marked the difference. Yet there is evidence that Tel Dan did not remain secure forever. The city experienced periods of destruction and rebuilding, reflecting the instability of the wider region. Archaeological layers preserve traces of these changes, but reconstructing the exact sequence of events is difficult. Was a particular destruction caused by invasion? Was it connected with internal political conflict? Did warfare, economic pressure, or changing regional power contribute? In some cases, archaeology can identify burning, destruction, or rebuilding without being able to identify the people responsible with absolute certainty. This is where the mystery deepens. A collapsed wall can tell us that something happened. It cannot always tell us why. More speculative interpretations have occasionally treated the massive ramparts as evidence of forgotten engineering traditions or extraordinary construction capabilities. Because some of the defensive structures are large and visually imposing, they have sometimes been presented as evidence that conventional archaeological explanations are somehow inadequate. But there is no need to invoke unknown technology to appreciate the achievement. Ancient societies could mobilize large numbers of workers over long periods. They could quarry stone, transport materials, manufacture mud bricks, shape earthworks, and coordinate enormous construction projects. The real mystery is organizational. Who commanded the labor? How were supplies provided? How long did construction take? And what did the people building these defenses believe they were protecting? A city is not only stone and earth, it is a community. Every rampart represented countless hours of labor by people whose names are lost. Farmers may have left their fields to work on the walls. Craftsmen may have produced bricks. Builders may have developed techniques passed from one generation to another. The finished fortification concealed all of that human effort behind a single imposing structure. Today, only fragments remain. The walls that once dominated the landscape have been reduced in height. Buildings have collapsed. Streets have disappeared beneath layers of soil. The people who once passed through the Great Gateway are gone. But the defensive system still provides a strange connection to them. A stone, placed into a wall thousands of years ago, was intended to remain. And it did. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Tel Dan is that the people who constructed these enormous defenses understood that danger was never entirely absent. Walls are expressions of uncertainty. They exist because the future cannot be trusted. Someone once looked across this landscape and decided that protection was necessary. Someone calculated how high the barriers should rise. Someone ordered the construction of gates that could control movement. And somewhere within those decisions lies a story we can only partially recover. Was Tel Dan primarily defended because its rulers feared invasion? Did its strategic position make conflict inevitable? Did the walls symbolize the authority of a powerful kingdom? Or did they serve purposes that modern archaeology has not yet fully recognized? The evidence gives us remarkable pieces of the answer, but the complete story remains fragmented. The ancient ramparts still stand beneath the trees, beside the springs that continue to flow, as they did long before the city was built. Water still moves through the landscape. The mountains still rise beyond it. But the voices that once echoed against the walls have disappeared. And perhaps, somewhere beneath the later layers of earth and stone, another piece of the story is still waiting to be found. A forgotten structure, an undisturbed layer, or a small object capable of revealing why the people of Tel Dan believed these enormous defenses were worth building in the first place. From the monumental defenses of Tel Dan, where massive ramparts mark the boundaries of a strategically important city, our journey now moves westward to the Atlantic edge of Europe. Here, in the rugged landscape of County Kerry, stone forts rise from green hills and rocky fields, blending so naturally into the terrain that they can seem less like ruins than ancient parts of the landscape itself. These are the Kerry stone forts. Scattered across the Iveragh Peninsula and other parts of southwestern Ireland, these prehistoric and early historic stone enclosures are among the most striking remnants of life in ancient Ireland. Their thick circular walls were built from locally available stone, often without mortar, and some survived to impressive heights. From a distance, they appear almost simple. A circle of stones, a wall, an entrance. But step closer, and the architecture becomes far more complicated. Massive blocks are carefully fitted together. Narrow passages disappear into the thickness of the walls. Some forts contain internal terraces, chambers, steps, and smaller enclosures. In certain examples, the builders seem to have transformed the wall itself into a structure that could be occupied, climbed, or defended. And the deeper we look, the less certain the original purpose becomes. The term stone fort suggests a military function, and defense was almost certainly important in at least some cases. But archaeologists generally understand these structures as settlements or enclosed homesteads rather than purely military installations. That distinction is significant. A fortress is built primarily to keep people out. A defended settlement is built to protect people who live inside. The Kerry forts may have been homes belonging to communities that valued both security and status. Their circular form was not unique to Ireland. Roundhouses and enclosed settlements were widespread in prehistoric Atlantic Europe. But the monumental stone walls found in parts of Kerry represent an extraordinary investment of labor. Why build such thick walls around a household? Why use enormous stones when smaller materials might have been sufficient? And why do some of these structures appear far more elaborate than others? One explanation is social status. A substantial stone enclosure could have served as a visible statement of wealth and authority. Building a massive fort required access to land, labor, time, and resources. The wall itself may have communicated the importance of the family or group living inside. In this interpretation, the fort was not simply protection. It was architecture as social language. The larger the enclosure, the greater the statement. But the landscape complicates this idea. Many Kerry forts occupy elevated or naturally defensible positions, often with broad views across valleys, coastlines, and surrounding hills. From inside the walls, inhabitants could observe movement across the countryside. That would have been useful in an environment where communities competed for land, livestock, and resources. Cattle were particularly important to prehistoric Irish society, and protecting livestock could have been just as important as protecting people. A defended enclosure could therefore serve several purposes at once. It could shelter a family, protect animals, store food, control access, demonstrate status, and provide refuge during periods of danger. The problem is that the archaeological evidence rarely tells us which function mattered most. Some forts contain domestic remains, while others preserve little evidence of permanent occupation. This variation suggests that not every enclosure served exactly the same purpose. And then there are the internal features. Certain forts contain what appear to be underground passages or chambers known as souterrains. These narrow spaces extend beneath or alongside the structures, creating another layer of mystery. Their functions have been debated. Storage is one possibility. Shelter is another. Some may have been designed as concealed routes or places where valuables could be protected. The darkness of these spaces naturally invites more imaginative interpretations. Over time, underground chambers in ancient settlements have been associated with rituals, initiation ceremonies, or supernatural beliefs. But evidence for such uses varies considerably. The temptation to turn every underground structure into a sacred chamber is understandable, especially when its original purpose has been forgotten. Yet, prehistoric people had practical reasons for building underground spaces. Temperature remains relatively stable below ground. Food can be stored more securely. Valuable objects can be hidden. People can shelter from danger. The simplest explanation may sometimes be the most appropriate, but it may not explain everything. Because these forts were not built in isolation. They belonged to communities that lived within a wider cultural landscape filled with monuments, burial places, standing stones, and natural features that may have carried symbolic significance. A settlement could therefore have practical and ceremonial dimensions at the same time. Perhaps the walls protected a household while also expressing its relationship with ancestors or territory. Perhaps the circular enclosure represented an ordered world surrounded by an uncertain landscape. Or perhaps those meanings are modern interpretations imposed on structures whose original symbolism can no longer be recovered. This uncertainty is part of what makes the Kerry forts so compelling. Their builders left no written instructions. No architect recorded the design. No inscription explains why one wall was made larger than another. Instead, archaeology gives us fragments: stone, pottery, tools, animal remains, soil layers, traces of fire. Each piece helps reconstruct a vanished community, but none provides a complete explanation. There is also something deeply atmospheric about these sites. Unlike monumental ruins that dominate cities or deserts, the Kerry forts remain embedded within a living landscape. Grass grows against the walls. Rain darkens the stones. Sheep move across nearby fields. Clouds drift over the hills. The ruins are not separate from nature. They are part of it. That can make their age difficult to comprehend. A wall built thousands of years ago can look almost ordinary when surrounded by the same green hills that remain today. But consider what that wall represents. Someone selected those stones. Someone carried them. Someone placed them. Someone decided where the entrance should be. Someone determined how high the enclosure needed to rise. And someone lived inside it, perhaps believing that these walls would protect their family for generations. Perhaps they did. Perhaps the fort remained in use long after its original builders were gone, altered by people who inherited it and gave it new meaning. That possibility could explain why some structures appear to contain multiple phases of construction. The Kerry forts may therefore be less like monuments frozen in time and more like living buildings that were repeatedly adapted. A wall could be repaired. A chamber could be added. An entrance could be modified. An enclosure could change from one generation to another. Eventually, however, the communities that maintained them disappeared or moved elsewhere. The reasons remain uncertain. Changes in settlement patterns, agriculture, political organization, population, or broader cultural transformations may all have played a role. There is no single dramatic event that explains the abandonment of every fort, and that is perhaps another misconception worth considering. Ancient places do not always end with catastrophe. Sometimes they simply become unnecessary. A family moves, a community reorganizes, a new center becomes more important. A building that once mattered enormously is gradually forgotten. The stones remain. Today, the Kerry forts preserve that silence. They tell us that prehistoric communities possessed impressive construction skills and sophisticated social organization. They show how people adapted architecture to the rugged Atlantic environment. But they still leave fundamental questions unanswered. Were these forts primarily defensive homes? Symbols of status? Places of refuge? Centers of local authority? Or did their meanings shift over generations? Perhaps several explanations are correct at once. Perhaps the walls protected both people and identity. And perhaps the most intriguing mystery is not how these enormous stone circles were built, but what it meant to live behind them, to wake each morning inside a fortified ring of stone, look across the Kerry landscape, and know that the same walls surrounding you had been raised by human hands long before your own. The builders are gone. Their language is largely silent. Their beliefs remain uncertain. Yet their stones still form circles across the hills, holding open a question that has survived with them. Were these walls built simply to keep danger outside, or were they also meant to preserve something within that the passage of time has almost completely erased? High on a limestone plateau in the Derbyshire Peak District, the remains of Arbor Low lie beneath an immense open sky. There are no towering walls here, no carved statues, and no great monument rising above the landscape. Instead, scattered across the grass is a vast arrangement of weathered stones, forming an enormous oval ring around a central space. Some stones remain upright. Many have fallen. Yet, even in their broken state, the arrangement retains a remarkable sense of order. The wind moves freely across the plateau, carrying little sound beyond the grass and the occasional cry of a distant bird. It is a landscape that can feel almost empty. But more than 4,000 years ago, people came here with a very different purpose. Arbor Low is one of the most important prehistoric henge monuments in Britain. Its origins reach back into the Neolithic period, when communities across the British Isles were beginning to construct monumental sites on a scale that required considerable planning, labor, and cooperation. The people who built Arbor Low left no written explanation for what happened here. There are no inscriptions telling us who they were, what ceremonies they performed, or why this particular place mattered. What remains is stone. And stone, in this case, raises more questions than it answers. The monument consists of a large oval enclosure surrounded by a substantial earthwork bank and ditch. Within it stands the famous arrangement of limestone blocks, originally forming an imposing stone circle. At the center is a large feature traditionally described as a possible cove or central setting, although its exact purpose remains uncertain. The stones themselves are impressive, but perhaps the most intriguing feature is their present condition. Almost every major stone is now lying on the ground. That has led to one of the enduring questions surrounding Arbor Low. Were the stones deliberately placed this way from the beginning? Were they once standing and later brought down? Or did some combination of natural processes and human activity gradually alter the monument? Archaeological evidence strongly suggests that the stones were once erected, or at least intended to form a monumental arrangement. The surrounding earthworks were carefully constructed, and the site appears to have been designed according to a coherent plan. Excavations have revealed evidence of activity extending over long periods, showing that Arbor Low was not simply created and immediately abandoned. Instead, it seems to have remained meaningful to prehistoric communities for generations. That alone is remarkable. Imagine standing here thousands of years ago, approaching the monument across the open landscape. The earthwork would have formed a substantial boundary. Beyond it, the stones would have created a striking visual presence. The monument would have been visible from surrounding areas, transforming an otherwise natural stretch of limestone plateau into something unmistakably artificial. But what happened inside that enclosure? This is where certainty begins to fade. Henge monuments are generally understood as ceremonial or communal spaces. Archaeologists have found evidence at various British henges suggesting gatherings, ritual activity, feasting, burials, and complex relationships between communities and the landscape. Arbor Low may have served some combination of these functions, yet calling it a ceremonial monument does not fully explain it. Ceremonial for what? For whom? And what experiences were intended to take place within the circle? There is no surviving text to answer these questions. We can reconstruct the physical structure, study its position, examine the archaeological remains, and compare it with other prehistoric monuments. But the thoughts of the people who stood among these stones remain inaccessible. Perhaps this is part of what makes Arbor Low so unsettling. The monument is substantial enough to demonstrate intention, but silent enough to conceal it. Some researchers have suggested that Arbor Low may have been connected with funerary practices or ancestor traditions. Human remains and other prehistoric activity are known from the wider monument and its surroundings, although interpreting such evidence is difficult. Neolithic communities had complex relationships with the dead, and monuments could serve as places where memory, identity, ancestry, and community were brought together. If that was part of Arbor Low's purpose, then the stones may have represented more than architecture. They may have marked a boundary between ordinary life and a sacred or ancestral realm, and the landscape itself may have mattered just as much as the monument. Arbor Low occupies an elevated position, surrounded by the distinctive terrain of the Peak District. From the plateau, the horizon opens outward in several directions. Prehistoric monuments were rarely placed randomly. Their builders interacted with hills, valleys, rivers, caves, and distant landmarks, creating relationships between architecture and the natural world. Could Arbor Low have been designed to frame particular views? Could the movement of the sun, moon, or seasons have influenced activity here? These possibilities have attracted considerable attention, particularly because other prehistoric monuments in Britain demonstrate sophisticated awareness of celestial cycles. But the evidence does not allow every proposed alignment to be treated as established fact, and this distinction matters. Arbor Low has become surrounded by theories that reach far beyond conventional archaeology. Some interpretations suggest that the monument may have been an astronomical observatory, carefully arranged to monitor celestial events. Others have imagined it as a center for ancient religious traditions whose details were later forgotten. More speculative ideas have gone further still, suggesting that the builders possessed forms of knowledge far more advanced than traditionally assumed, or that Arbor Low was connected to a network of monuments encoding mathematical or astronomical information across prehistoric Britain. Such theories are difficult to demonstrate. There is no evidence that Arbor Low was constructed by a lost, advanced civilization, nor is there reliable evidence that its builders possessed technologies outside the capabilities of Neolithic communities. The monument can be understood, at least in broad terms, through the abilities of prehistoric people themselves, people capable of organizing labor, transporting stone, shaping earthworks, and maintaining traditions across generations. But acknowledging what we can explain does not eliminate the mystery. In some ways, it makes the remaining questions more interesting. Because the people who built Arbor Low did not need modern machinery to create something monumental. They needed time, cooperation, knowledge of the terrain, and a shared reason to undertake the work. What kind of belief could inspire an entire community to reshape a landscape? And what did they experience when they gathered here? Perhaps there were ceremonies at particular times of year. Perhaps people processed through the enclosure, carried objects, prepared food, honored the dead, or performed rituals that have left almost no archaeological trace. Perhaps the monument served several purposes at different moments in its long history. The stones may even have changed meaning over time. A place built by one generation could become an ancestral landmark for another. A ceremony could disappear while the monument remained. New traditions could emerge around structures whose original purpose was no longer remembered. This possibility is particularly compelling because Arbor Low was not simply a monument in isolation. The wider landscape contains other prehistoric remains, including burial monuments and stone structures, suggesting that this part of Derbyshire was an active and meaningful environment during prehistory. Arbor Low may therefore have belonged to a much larger cultural landscape, one whose original connections have been fragmented by thousands of years. Weather, erosion, farming, later construction, and human disturbance have all altered the site. The stones themselves have suffered the passage of time, yet enough survives to reveal the extraordinary effort involved in creating the monument. And perhaps that is the most haunting aspect of Arbor Low. The people who built it are gone. Their language is gone. Their names are gone. Whatever songs were sung here, whatever stories were told, whatever rituals took place within the ring have disappeared beyond recovery. Only the arrangement of stone and earth remains. Standing among those fallen blocks today, it is tempting to search for a single explanation. Perhaps Arbor Low was a ceremonial center. Perhaps it was connected to ancestors. Perhaps astronomical observations played a role. Perhaps its purpose changed repeatedly across centuries. The evidence allows some possibilities to be explored, but none completely restores the world that created the monument. And so Arbor Low remains suspended between knowledge and uncertainty, a place where archaeology can tell us how the monument was built, roughly when it was used, and something about the people who occupied the surrounding landscape, while leaving the deeper meaning just beyond reach. The stones are still here. The people who gave them meaning are not. And beneath the quiet grass of this ancient plateau, there may still be traces of a story that has survived for thousands of years without ever revealing its final chapter. From the windswept stones of Arbor Low, where prehistoric communities transformed an open plateau into a place of gathering and ritual, our journey now moves far to the southeast, into the rugged mountains of southern Bulgaria. Here, on a rocky summit above the eastern Rhodope landscape, another monument rises from the past, not as a silent circle of stones, but as an entire city carved directly into the mountain. This is Perperikon. The approach is striking. Broken walls emerge from the rock. Stairways cut through massive stone surfaces. Foundations, courtyards, chambers, reservoirs, and passages appear to have been shaped from the mountain itself. From the summit, the surrounding valleys unfold toward the horizon, and it becomes easy to understand why this location could have held strategic and religious importance for thousands of years. Perperikon is not a single monument from a single period. It is a layered archaeological landscape. Evidence suggests human activity here stretches back deep into prehistory, with later communities repeatedly returning to the same commanding location. Over centuries, the site developed through different cultural phases, eventually becoming an important Thracian center before being incorporated into the wider political and religious worlds of the Roman and Byzantine periods. That long sequence is one of the first things that makes Perperikon so difficult to understand. The stones belong to different ages. Walls were rebuilt. Spaces changed function. Old structures were incorporated into newer ones. And somewhere within this accumulation of architecture, a much older sacred landscape appears to have survived. For centuries, the surrounding region was associated with the Thracians, whose societies flourished across southeastern Europe during antiquity. The Thracians left behind impressive tombs, sanctuaries, fortifications, and artworks, yet their own written record is limited. Much of what is known about their religious practices comes from archaeology and from accounts written by Greek and Roman authors. Among those accounts is a particularly intriguing tradition. Ancient writers described a famous sanctuary of Dionysus somewhere in the Rhodope Mountains, a place where priests supposedly delivered prophecies to those who came seeking divine guidance. Its exact location has been debated for generations. Some have proposed that Perperikon may be connected with this sanctuary. The possibility is tantalizing, but it remains a matter of interpretation rather than settled fact. The connection became especially compelling because of Perperikon's monumental architecture and its location within the Rhodope Mountains. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of cult activity, ceremonial spaces, and features that suggest the site was more than a simple fortified settlement. At the heart of the complex lies a remarkable rock-cut area containing a large ceremonial hall and a distinctive stone feature often associated with ritual activity. Could this have been part of the sanctuary described by ancient authors? Perhaps, but archaeology rarely provides such convenient answers. Ancient descriptions can be vague. Names can disappear. Landscapes change. Places mentioned by writers centuries ago may be difficult to identify with modern certainty. And there is another complication. Perperikon was occupied and modified for an extraordinarily long period. Even if one particular area served as a sacred sanctuary during the Thracian period, later inhabitants could have altered it beyond recognition. A sacred space could become a defensive structure. A ceremonial chamber could be reused for another purpose. A wall built for one generation could become the foundation of another. The mountain itself became a kind of historical archive. Layer after layer accumulated, and within those layers, the boundaries between religion, politics, and warfare become increasingly difficult to separate. Perperikon was not merely a place where people worshipped. It was also a place where power could be concentrated. The summit's natural defenses and commanding position made it strategically valuable. Fortifications were constructed and strengthened over time, creating a complex settlement that could shelter inhabitants and control movement through the surrounding region. This combination of sacred and defensive architecture raises an important question. Was Perperikon powerful because it was sacred, or sacred because it was powerful? Perhaps the distinction did not exist for the people who lived here. In the ancient world, religious authority and political authority could be deeply intertwined. A ruler connected to a sanctuary could gain legitimacy. A sacred site could attract wealth, visitors, and influence. A prophecy could become politically significant if people believed it revealed the will of the gods. And that brings us back to the mysterious oracle. Ancient sources associate the sanctuary of Dionysus with prophetic activity. One famous account, preserved by the Greek historian Strabo, describes an oracle in which a priestess stood over an altar and gave prophecies while experiencing a divine state. The story has fascinated generations of historians. Some later interpretations have attempted to connect famous figures from antiquity with the oracle at the Rhodope sanctuary, including Alexander the Great and his father, Philip II of Macedon. Yet these associations are difficult to verify, and the precise location of the sanctuary remains debated. Still, the possibility gives Perperikon an unusual atmosphere. Imagine standing on this mountain more than 2,000 years ago. Below you, the valleys stretch into the distance. Around you are walls, carved stairways, ritual spaces, and people arriving from distant communities. Some may have come for trade, others for protection, others perhaps for religious ceremonies, and some may have arrived carrying questions about the future. What would it have felt like to enter a sanctuary believed to possess access to the divine? What did visitors hear? What did they see? And how were prophecies interpreted after the ceremony ended? The archaeological remains cannot answer these questions directly. They can reveal where people stood, where structures were built, where fires burned, and how spaces were organized. But belief itself leaves a much more elusive trace. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative interpretations of Perperikon. Some theories portray the site as an unusually advanced sacred complex, whose builders supposedly possessed sophisticated astronomical or mathematical knowledge. Others have imagined hidden chambers, secret rituals, or underground passages serving purposes that have not yet been fully understood. There are also claims that Perperikon may conceal undiscovered structures beneath its surviving ruins. Such possibilities are difficult to assess without archaeological evidence. Ancient sites often contain more than what is visible on the surface, but the existence of an unexplored space does not automatically imply a hidden chamber or lost technology. The more cautious explanation may be less dramatic, but in some ways more fascinating. Perperikon was repeatedly rebuilt because people repeatedly found reasons to return. That continuity itself is extraordinary. The site survived changing cultures, political transformations, and the expansion of Roman influence. Christianity eventually became dominant in the region, and later structures reflect the changing religious world. Medieval fortifications and settlements occupied parts of the ancient complex, creating yet another layer over the older remains. At some point, however, the settlement declined. Its importance faded. The mountain became quieter. Walls collapsed. Stairways were buried. Vegetation gradually reclaimed parts of the ruins. For centuries, the site remained largely unknown beyond the surrounding region. Then, archaeology began to reveal what had been left behind. What emerged was not a simple fortress. It was a palimpsest, a place repeatedly occupied, transformed, and reinterpreted across thousands of years. And perhaps that is where the real mystery of Perperikon lies. Not in the possibility of a single secret chamber or forgotten prophecy, but in the question of why this particular mountain continued to matter for so long. Was it the natural strength of the location, its access to resources, its commanding view, its religious significance? Or did generations of people inherit the belief that something important had already happened here, giving the mountain a sacred reputation that survived even as cultures changed? We may never know. The stones provide fragments, but the original voices are silent. A carved staircase can tell us that people climbed the mountain. A fortified wall can tell us that they feared attack. A ceremonial space can suggest ritual, but none of these things can tell us what a person felt while standing there, waiting for a prophecy, preparing for a ceremony, or looking across the Rhodope valleys from the summit. Today, Perperikon remains exposed to the same winds that have crossed these mountains for centuries. Its walls stand broken but recognizable. Its carved surfaces still bear the marks of human labor. And somewhere among those stones may lie evidence capable of changing what we understand about the site's past. Perhaps future excavations will clarify the relationship between Perperikon and the ancient oracle described by classical writers. Perhaps they will reveal that the connection was mistaken. Or perhaps the mountain still holds structures, objects, or traces that have not yet been uncovered. For now, Perperikon remains a place where history is unusually visible, and yet the meaning behind much of what survives remains just beyond reach. From the monumental heights of Perperikon, where generations repeatedly return to the same mountain to build, worship, defend, and remember, our journey now moves toward a very different landscape. The mountains of the Balkans give way to the warmer eastern Mediterranean, where the remains of one of Cyprus's earliest permanent communities lie scattered across a low hillside above the Moroni River Valley. Here, the mystery is not carved into a towering fortress. It is built into the shape of ordinary homes. At first glance, Khirokitia appears almost modest. Low stone walls emerge from the earth. Circular foundations form clusters across the hillside. Some structures have been partially reconstructed, giving an impression of what the settlement may once have looked like. There are no monumental gateways, enormous statues, or royal tombs announcing the presence of a powerful ruler. Instead, there are houses, round houses. Again and again, the same basic form appears. More than 9,000 years ago, people were living here in a community whose organization tells us far more about early settled life than its quiet appearance might suggest. Khirokitia, also known as Khirokitia, is one of the most important Neolithic archaeological sites in the eastern Mediterranean. Its occupation dates broadly from the 7th millennium BC, making it a remarkable window into a period when communities were undergoing profound changes. People were increasingly settling in permanent or semi-permanent communities. They were cultivating plants. They were managing animals. They were building houses. And they were beginning to reshape their relationship with the landscape in ways that would eventually transform human society. But Khirokitia does not simply tell the story of settlement. It raises a more difficult question. Why did these people build their homes in this particular way? And what happened inside those circular structures? Walking through the ruins today, the settlement can feel strangely repetitive. One round structure stands beside another, separated by narrow passages and walls. Some buildings appear to have been reconstructed or modified multiple times. The arrangement suggests that this was not a collection of isolated households scattered randomly across the countryside. It was a community, a tightly organized one. The settlement was constructed on a hillside, with buildings following the natural contours of the terrain. The surrounding environment offered access to water and agricultural land, while the elevated position may have provided practical advantages. Yet, the architecture is unlike the rectangular houses that would become common across many later agricultural societies. At Khirokitia, circular architecture dominated. The houses generally had thick stone walls and compact interiors. Some contained internal features such as hearths, platforms, or working areas. Evidence suggests that structures could be rebuilt repeatedly, sometimes on or over earlier remains. This raises an intriguing possibility. The people of Khirokitia were not simply constructing houses. They may have been continuously reshaping spaces that carried memories. A building could be repaired. A wall could be raised. A floor could be replaced. A new structure could appear over an older one. Over generations, the settlement itself became layered with traces of earlier lives, and that makes archaeology here particularly fascinating, because the site preserves more than architecture. It preserves fragments of daily existence, stone tools, animal remains, plant evidence, burials, objects associated with domestic activity. Each discovery offers another small glimpse into the lives of people who left no written accounts. We do not know their names. We do not know the language they spoke. We do not know what they called their settlement. Even the name Khirokitia comes from much later history. The people themselves remain anonymous. Yet their physical environment survives. And perhaps nowhere is this more revealing than in the relationship between the living and the dead. Archaeological investigations at Khirokitia have uncovered human burials associated with the settlement. In some cases, individuals were buried beneath or within domestic structures. This is one of the site's most intriguing characteristics. Why place the dead beneath the homes of the living? The practice is not unique to prehistoric Cyprus. Other Neolithic communities in different regions also placed human remains beneath floors or within settlements. Such practices may have connected ancestors with family spaces, land, memory, or community identity, but the precise meaning remains uncertain. Was the burial intended to keep the dead close to their descendants? Did the deceased retain a social role after death? Were these individuals remembered as ancestors? Or did the burial have a more practical or symbolic purpose that we no longer understand? There is no surviving explanation, only the pattern, and patterns can be powerful. If the dead were repeatedly placed beneath houses, perhaps the boundary between the living and the deceased was not as sharply defined as it is in many societies today. A house may have been more than a shelter. It could have been a place of memory, a place where generations remained connected, a place where the physical presence of the dead became part of everyday life. But even this interpretation must remain cautious. Archaeology can identify where bodies were placed and how they were positioned. It can sometimes determine age, sex, injuries, diet, disease, and other biological details. It cannot directly recover belief. That distinction becomes increasingly important when we examine the architecture itself. Khirokitia's round houses have often attracted speculation because they appear so different from later domestic structures. Some reconstructions suggest that the buildings may have had upper levels or elevated internal platforms. The exact appearance of individual structures may have varied considerably over time. The circular form could have had practical advantages. It distributes forces efficiently. It can be constructed with relatively simple techniques. It may also have suited local building materials and environmental conditions. In other words, there may be nothing mysterious about the basic shape. And yet, the repetition of that shape across the settlement still invites deeper questions. Why did this architectural tradition become so persistent? Was it simply inherited from earlier generations? Did the circle carry symbolic meaning? Or was it simply the most effective form for the needs of the community? Perhaps the answer is not one of these possibilities, but all three. Architecture is rarely only practical. A structure can solve a practical problem while simultaneously expressing social traditions. A house can provide shelter while also communicating identity. The shape of a doorway, the position of a hearth, or the arrangement of sleeping areas can reflect customs that inhabitants themselves may never have consciously questioned. For the people of Khirokitia, circular construction may simply have been the normal way a house was supposed to be built. But there is another feature that makes the settlement especially intriguing. Its organization suggests that the community was capable of considerable collective effort. Large quantities of stone had to be gathered and transported. Walls had to be constructed and maintained. Paths and spaces had to be organized. Food had to be produced or acquired. Animals had to be managed. Tools had to be made, and children had to be raised within this increasingly permanent environment. This was not an isolated family surviving alone. It was a functioning community. And that brings us to one of the great transformations of human history. The movement toward settled life did not simply provide humans with permanent houses. It changed relationships. Once people began living together in stable settlements, new questions emerged. Who owned the land? Who controlled resources? Who made decisions? How were disputes resolved? How were responsibilities divided? And how did communities maintain cooperation among growing populations? Khirokitia provides fragments of evidence, but it cannot provide a complete social blueprint. There are no written laws, no royal inscriptions, no records of political institutions, no explanation of how authority worked. The settlement simply exists, frozen in archaeological traces. This absence has sometimes encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some writers have imagined Khirokitia as evidence of an unusually advanced prehistoric society whose organization remains poorly understood. Others have suggested that its architecture may encode symbolic or astronomical principles. There are also broader claims that early Neolithic settlements represent knowledge inherited from civilizations that supposedly existed before conventional history. Such theories are difficult to demonstrate. There is currently no reliable evidence that Khirokitia was built by a lost advanced civilization, or that its inhabitants possessed technologies outside the capabilities of Neolithic communities. The archaeological record instead points toward people who were adapting gradually to settled life, using stone tools, local resources, agriculture, animal management, and accumulated knowledge. But accepting this does not make Khirokitia ordinary. Quite the opposite. It forces us to confront how much prehistoric communities were capable of achieving without written language, metal tools, or modern machinery. The people of Khirokitia lived thousands of years before the construction of the great monuments of Egypt. Long before classical Greek temples. Long before the Roman world. Long before cities became familiar features of Mediterranean civilization. Yet they were already building from the circular houses of Khirokitia, where the traces of ordinary domestic life have survived for more than 9,000 years. Our journey now moves westward across the Mediterranean to an island where prehistoric communities left behind something more imposing. Corsica. Here, among rugged mountains, granite valleys, forests, and windswept plateaus, the landscape is scattered with ancient stones. Some stand alone. Others form small groups. And in several places, enormous slabs were carefully arranged to create structures whose original meanings have long since disappeared. Among the most intriguing are the dolmens of Corsica. They are not enormous monuments on the scale of the great megalithic structures of later Europe. Many are surprisingly modest in size, yet their simplicity can make them more mysterious, because there is so little about them that explains why they were built. A few massive stones, a carefully positioned chamber, a heavy capstone resting above it, and around them the silence of the Corsican landscape. The best-known examples include monuments such as the Fontanaccia Dolmen, near Sartène, as well as other megalithic remains scattered through southern Corsica. Together, these sites form part of a broader prehistoric tradition that transformed the island's natural landscape into a setting marked by stone. To the modern eye, a dolmen can appear almost architectural in its simplicity. Vertical stones support a horizontal slab. That is essentially the structure. But constructing even a small dolmen would have required planning, labor, and cooperation. The stones were not always conveniently positioned where they were needed. They had to be selected, moved, raised, and stabilized, and once the monument was completed, it had to mean something. The builders did not leave inscriptions. They did not carve explanations into the granite. They left only the structure itself. That silence is where the mystery begins. Archaeologists generally interpret Corsican dolmens as megalithic monuments associated with funerary or ceremonial practices. In prehistoric Europe, dolmens frequently formed or covered burial chambers, and human remains have been found in some megalithic contexts. But even when a monument can be identified as funerary, another question immediately follows. What kind of funerary monument was it? Was it a tomb for an important individual? A collective burial place? A sacred space associated with ancestors? Or did its meaning extend beyond the treatment of the dead? The archaeological evidence does not always provide a single answer. Corsica makes the problem even more complicated because its prehistoric landscape contains several different kinds of megalithic structures. There are dolmens. There are standing stones or menhirs. There are stone alignments. There are larger ceremonial complexes. And there are monuments whose original functions remain debated. Together, they suggest that prehistoric Corsicans were not simply placing stones at random. They were participating in a wider tradition of monumental construction. But what was happening across the island during this period? Corsica was already inhabited long before the construction of its most famous megalithic monuments. Communities had developed ways of exploiting the island's resources, cultivating crops, keeping animals, working stone, and establishing settlements. Over time, social structures changed. Communities became more interconnected. New technologies appeared, and eventually, metalworking transformed parts of prehistoric society. The dolmens belonged to this changing world. They were not created by people living completely outside history. They were built by communities with their own traditions, social relationships, and ideas about death and place. Yet, we know almost nothing about those ideas directly. There is no Corsican Neolithic manuscript explaining the purpose of a dolmen. No surviving priest describes the ceremonies. No ancient traveler records what people believed when they approached these stones. Instead, archaeologists must reconstruct meaning from fragments, and sometimes the fragments are frustratingly incomplete. Take the architecture itself. The slabs are enormous compared with the people who would have assembled them. Even without sophisticated machinery, prehistoric communities could move heavy stones using ropes, wooden supports, rollers, prepared paths, and coordinated labor. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that surprisingly large stones can be transported using relatively simple technologies when enough people cooperate. So there is no need to invoke unknown technology to explain the construction. But the practical explanation creates another mystery. Why spend such effort? Why invest labor in a structure that may have served primarily as a tomb or ritual monument? The answer may lie in the importance of collective memory. A permanent stone monument could mark a place where the dead were remembered. It could establish a connection between a community and a particular piece of land. It could communicate identity. It could demonstrate cooperation. And perhaps it could transform an ordinary landscape into a place with a history. Once erected, the monument would outlast the people who built it. Children could see it. Grandchildren could return to it. Generations later, people might still recognize the same stones. In that sense, a dolmen was not merely a tomb. It could become a statement of permanence. And this may explain why the landscape surrounding Corsican megaliths matters so much. These monuments were not constructed in empty spaces without context. They occupy valleys, ridges, plateaus, and elevated areas where the natural terrain itself becomes part of the experience. The stone of the monument resembles the stone of the island. The granite landscape seems almost to continue into the structure. Perhaps that was intentional. Perhaps the builders saw no sharp distinction between the natural world and the monument they created. Or perhaps the location was selected for practical reasons: visibility, access, proximity to settlements, or the availability of suitable stone. Once again, several explanations can exist at the same time. And then there are the menhirs. Some Corsican standing stones are simple slabs. Others are more carefully shaped. At certain sites, standing stones form groups or alignments, creating an additional layer of complexity. This raises the possibility that dolmens and standing stones belong to interconnected traditions. Were they part of the same ritual landscape? Did one represent the dead, while another represented living communities? Were the stones intended to mark territory? Or did they have symbolic meanings that changed over generations? The evidence remains incomplete, and the absence of written language leaves enormous room for interpretation. It is here that more speculative theories sometimes enter the story. Some have suggested that Corsican megaliths were designed according to hidden astronomical principles, with their positions reflecting the movement of the sun or other celestial bodies. Others have proposed that the monuments formed part of a much wider prehistoric network extending across the Mediterranean. There is certainly evidence that prehistoric communities across Europe observed seasonal cycles and possessed detailed knowledge of their environments. But not every alignment is necessarily intentional. A monument can face a particular direction simply because of the terrain, local traditions, or practical considerations. Without stronger archaeological evidence, astronomical interpretations remain possibilities rather than established facts. Still, the idea is difficult to dismiss completely. The prehistoric world depended heavily on seasonal rhythms. Agriculture, animal breeding, travel, and food gathering all required awareness of changing conditions. The rising and setting of the sun marked the passage of time. The moon governed natural cycles. The changing position of the stars provided another way of understanding the night sky. Would such observations have influenced monumental construction? Perhaps. But even if they did, we still would not know what the builders intended those celestial relationships to represent: a calendar, a sacred cycle, a connection between ancestors and the heavens, or simply a practical understanding of the seasons. There is another unsettling possibility. Perhaps some monuments were already ancient when later generations began using them. A community might inherit a dolmen built by people whose original beliefs were only partially remembered. Imagine returning to a structure that your ancestors constructed centuries earlier. You know it is important. You know that something happened there. But the original explanation has been lost. What would you do? You might create new traditions around it. You might reinterpret its purpose. You might associate it with ancestors, spirits, heroes, or supernatural events. The monument would remain the same, while its meaning changed. This process could help explain why prehistoric monuments sometimes appear to have long and complicated histories. Stone survives. Belief changes. The physical monument becomes a fixed point around which different generations build new interpretations. And Corsica may preserve several examples of this process. The island's megalithic monuments belong to periods of major transformation, when communities were developing new technologies and increasingly complex social structures. Eventually, the Bronze Age would bring new forms of material culture. Later, still came Phoenician, Greek, Roman, and medieval influences. Each period introduced new traditions. Yet, the prehistoric stones remained. From the granite dolmens of Corsica, where prehistoric communities transformed enormous slabs of stone into monuments whose meanings have almost completely disappeared, our journey now crosses the Mediterranean once again and returns to the banks of the Nile. Here, the mystery takes a different form. It is not a circle of standing stones, not a burial chamber hidden beneath a hill, not a fortress carved into a mountain. It is a city, or, more precisely, the remains of one. In the dry landscape on the western bank of the Nile at Luxor, archaeologists uncovered something that had remained hidden beneath layers of earth for more than 3,000 years. Walls emerged from the ground. Rooms appeared. Workshops, storage areas, streets, and domestic spaces began to reveal themselves. The discovery was extraordinary, but almost immediately it became associated with a name that seemed to belong to legend: the Lost Golden City. Its ancient name was likely connected with the Aten, the solar deity whose worship transformed Egypt during one of the most unusual periods of its history. Archaeologists identify the settlement with the world of the 18th dynasty, and particularly with the reigns of Amenhotep III and his successor, Akhenaten. And around this city, another word has gradually appeared in popular culture: curse. But where did that idea come from? Was there really a curse connected with this lost settlement? Or has the language of curses simply grown around an archaeological discovery because Egypt's ancient cities have always occupied a strange place between history, mythology, and imagination? To understand the mystery, we have to begin with what is actually known. The settlement was discovered near Luxor in 2020 and publicly announced in 2021 after archaeological work revealed a substantial urban complex. The remains included houses, workshops, administrative areas, storage spaces, and evidence of everyday activity. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities describes the site as an important settlement connected with the reign of Amenhotep III and the later period of Akhenaten. This was not a fantasy city hidden in some unreachable desert. It was a real place. People lived here, they worked here, they manufactured objects here, they stored goods here, they moved through its streets, and eventually they left. That final detail is where the atmosphere begins to change. Because the city was not simply forgotten in the way a modern town might be abandoned. It became buried. The walls gradually disappeared beneath the earth. The streets vanished. The rooms filled with sediment. And over the centuries, the landscape concealed an entire urban community. When archaeologists began exposing the remains, they found a surprisingly well-preserved picture of ordinary life. There were areas associated with food production. Workshops reveal craft activity. Storage spaces suggest organized administration. Residential structures provide clues about how people lived. The city was not simply a royal palace. It was a functioning settlement supporting the economic and administrative machinery of a powerful kingdom. And this is important because the popular phrase "Golden City" can easily create the wrong impression. The name does not mean archaeologists discovered a city literally made of gold. It is a modern descriptive name reflecting the site's remarkable significance and the richness of its archaeological evidence. Gold itself, however, was undeniably important to ancient Egyptian society. It was associated with royalty and the gods, and Egypt possessed major sources of gold in the eastern deserts and Nubian regions. Gold objects have been found at many archaeological sites, including settlements and tombs. But the lost Golden City was valuable for another reason. It revealed something much rarer than treasure. It revealed daily life. For decades, ancient Egypt has often been presented through its monuments. Pyramids, temples, royal tombs, colossal statues, golden funerary masks. These objects are magnificent, but they represent only a small portion of ancient society. Most Egyptians did not live inside royal tombs. They lived, worked, cooked, traded, raised children, repaired tools, and carried out repetitive tasks that rarely appear in monumental art. A settlement like this brings those forgotten lives closer to the surface. And yet, the city is closely connected to one of Egypt's most controversial rulers, Akhenaten. Before his reign, Egypt's religious landscape centered on a complex group of gods, with Amun holding enormous influence, particularly at Thebes. Then came a dramatic transformation. Akhenaten elevated the Aten, represented as the sun disk, to an unprecedented position within royal religious ideology. He changed his own name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten, and established a new capital, Akhetaten, at modern Amarna. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities describes Akhetaten as a new capital founded on previously undeveloped ground, with temples, palaces, administrative buildings, and elite residences arranged along the Nile. It was a radical departure, and it did not last. After Akhenaten's death, the religious order shifted again. His successors abandoned the city at Akhetaten. The old religious traditions regained their prominence. Akhenaten's name was increasingly excluded from official memory. His monuments were dismantled or reused. His reign became one of the most unusual episodes in Egyptian history. So, where does the lost Golden City fit into this transformation? Archaeologists believe the settlement predates or overlaps with the Amarna period and provides evidence for the life and administration of Egypt before the move to Akhetaten. In other words, the city may help illuminate the world from which Akhenaten's revolution emerged. Perhaps this was one of the environments in which the royal administration operated before the capital moved. Perhaps people from this settlement later became part of the great relocation toward Akhetaten. Perhaps the abandonment of the city was connected in some way to the political and religious changes of the period. But these relationships are complex. A city can continue functioning even while a royal court changes. A population can move gradually. Buildings can be reused. Administrative systems can survive political upheaval. The archaeological record rarely gives us a single dramatic moment when everything changed. And yet, the idea of a city abandoned after a profound religious revolution is powerful. It invites a story. A city filled with workers, a royal court obsessed with the sun, a new capital rising elsewhere, old gods being challenged, traditional institutions losing influence, and then silence. Could the settlement have been deliberately abandoned because of the political transformation? Perhaps. Could economic or administrative changes have played a role? Certainly possible. Could environmental factors have contributed? That too cannot be ruled out simply because the religious transformation is more dramatic. The evidence must be separated from the story. And then there is the question of the curse. Unlike the famous curse associated with Tutankhamun's tomb, there is no established ancient inscription at the lost Golden City declaring a supernatural punishment against anyone who disturbs it. There is no archaeological evidence demonstrating that excavation itself triggered a supernatural event. The curse belongs primarily to the modern imagination surrounding ancient Egypt. And yet the word continues to appear. Why? Part of the answer lies in the history of Egyptian archaeology itself. When Tutankhamun's tomb was opened in 1922, sensational stories about a curse spread rapidly through newspapers and popular culture. Deaths and misfortunes among people connected, directly or indirectly with the excavation, were interpreted by some as evidence of supernatural punishment. Modern historians have generally treated these claims with skepticism, but the legend survived. It became part of the mythology surrounding Egyptian archaeology. Every new discovery could therefore be presented through the shadow of an older story. A sealed tomb, a forgotten city, a royal name erased from history, a civilization that believed intensely in death and the afterlife. These ingredients naturally create an atmosphere in which the word curse seems almost inevitable. But there may be another kind of curse here. Not supernatural, historical. Akhenaten's reign was followed by an extraordinary attempt to erase or minimize aspects of his legacy. His monuments were dismantled. His name was omitted from later royal traditions. His city at Amarna was abandoned. A man who had once stood at the center of Egyptian power became almost a forbidden memory. And now, thousands of years later, archaeology is slowly bringing his world back. Could that be the real haunting element? Not that the dead are attacking the living, but that the past itself has been buried, deliberately or otherwise, and is now returning piece by piece. The lost Golden City provides an unusual opportunity to witness that return. Archaeologists can see the outlines of rooms. They can examine tools. They can study pottery. They can analyze animal remains. They can identify industrial areas. Each object tells us something. But collectively, they may reveal something even more important. The city was alive. Ancient Egypt was not only a civilization of pharaohs and temples, it was a civilization of workers, builders, potters, metal workers, administrators, farmers, servants, craftspeople, children, families, people whose names were never carved into monuments. Their lives were ordinary by the standards of their own world. Yet their ordinary lives are precisely what make the city extraordinary today. One of the most intriguing finds from the settlement is evidence of organized production and administration, suggesting that the site participated in a larger economic system. Such evidence reminds us that ancient cities were complex machines of human cooperation. But machines can stop. Political priorities can change. Royal courts can move. Religious systems can be transformed. And once the people leave, even a thriving city can become invisible. For centuries, perhaps nobody knew what lay beneath the ground at Luxor. The city remained there while later generations built their own worlds above it. Roman settlements came and went. Christian communities transformed the landscape. Islamic civilization reshaped the region. Modern Egypt grew around the ancient sites. And beneath all of this historical change, the remains of an earlier city waited. There is something profoundly unsettling about that kind of survival. A person can disappear. A family can disappear. An entire community can disappear. But the wall they built may remain. And sometimes, after thousands of years, someone uncovers it. This is where speculation begins to creep in. Could there be additional districts still hidden nearby? Could more administrative buildings reveal how the settlement was connected to the royal court? Could future excavations clarify why the city was abandoned? Could objects discovered in deeper layers reveal beliefs that have not yet been recognized? These are reasonable archaeological questions, but they also create the conditions for more imaginative theories. Some have suggested that the city might contain evidence capable of radically changing our understanding of the Amarna period. Others have imagined hidden chambers, secret royal connections, or knowledge deliberately concealed after Akhenaten's fall. There is currently no firm evidence that the settlement conceals a supernatural secret. But archaeological sites often surprise researchers precisely because the original inhabitants did not organize their lives according to modern expectations. A room that appears ordinary may reveal an unexpected function. A workshop may contain an unusual object. A seemingly insignificant inscription may identify a previously unknown official. A small piece of pottery can sometimes change the chronology of an entire building. The greatest discoveries are not always the most dramatic objects. Sometimes they are the smallest clues, and that means the lost Golden City may still have more to reveal. Perhaps the most fascinating mystery is not whether it was cursed. Perhaps it is why the memory of the place disappeared so completely. Who knew it existed after the last inhabitants left? Did later Egyptians walk across the buried remains without realizing what lay below? Did stories survive orally before disappearing? Was the settlement abandoned because of political transformation, economic necessity, environmental pressures, or some combination of forces? And what happened to the people who lived there? Did they move to Akhetaten? Did they return to other communities? Did their descendants remain in the region? Or did the population scatter across the Nile Valley, leaving the city behind? The stones cannot answer. The walls cannot speak. The workshops reveal activity, but not intention. The objects reveal technology, but not emotion. And the earth, which preserved the city for thousands of years, has preserved only fragments of the people who once filled its streets. Perhaps that is why the idea of a curse continues to linger. Not because the archaeology proves one, but because abandoned places have a way of making absence feel almost physical. A city once filled with voices is silent. A street once crowded with workers is empty. Rooms that once contained the ordinary sounds of human life are now archaeological spaces. And beneath the dry Egyptian light, the remains seem to ask their own question. How many other cities disappeared this way? How many communities were forgotten before anyone recorded their names? And if the lost Golden City could remain hidden beneath the earth for more than 3,000 years, what else might still be waiting beneath the sands of Egypt? Perhaps future excavations will explain the city's final days. Perhaps they will reveal more about its connection to Amenhotep III and the extraordinary religious transformation that followed. Perhaps the supposed curse will fade into what it most likely is, a modern legend attached to an ancient place. Or perhaps another discovery will complicate the story once again. For now, the ruins remain incomplete. The city has returned, but its people have not. Its streets have been uncovered, but their conversations are gone. Its workshops survive, but the hands that worked wit